soccer, but we're so much more than that.
We were ready to show the world real talent, real energy, real competitive drive.
But the story's the same everywhere. Women get paid less to do the same job. The fight for equal pay has been going on since this team started.
The mindset back then was you should just be grateful, darling, that you have a place to play.
Even though I'm on the USA team, I have to coach just to make ends meet. Childcare is more than my paychecks.
The men's team get more money, more marketing, better fields.
We were very frustrated and very angry. It's not fair.
The women on the U.S. soccer team are suing the U.S. Soccer Federation for equal pay. The USSF does argue some women on the team got more compensation than some of the men did.
It's like, really?
And then it was like, hold my beer.
What you see is what you get. Better take a sip on what purple lips like a lip.
If we win this World Cup, they would have no choice but to be on our side.
See is what you get.
That's when I felt the movement.
We got the entire world on our side.
I want to leave this team better than I found it on and also off the field.
This will be one of those landmark decisions talked about for decades.
Anything less than winning is a failure.
If you want the world to look a certain way, you have to fight to get there. It is time.
It is time.
It is time.
Let's fucking go.
Let's fucking go!
What you see is what you get.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. We are looking forward to this post-screening discussion of the film LFG. How many of you were excited to watch that, and especially knowing the great results in the end? We are here to celebrate their 24 million historic victory in February 2022 and learn more about how equal pay impacts women across occupations. Feel free to put your name and your organization in the chat so we know who's in this virtual room with us. We're so excited to have you. My name is Julie Ramirez. I'm the interim manager for the County of Santa Clara Office of Women's Policy. And I am so happy to be joined by my colleagues from local, state, and federal agencies who are experts in equal pay. These agencies include AAUW, the EEOC, the Department of Labor Women's Bureau, and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, and the local Catherine and George Alexander Community Law Center. Together, we make up the Bay Area Equal Pay Collaborative, strong since 2013. I want to let you know that we are live streaming this presentation on the Office of Women's Policy's Facebook page. So follow us there if you want to look back on this event. You can share it and view it later. And because this is webinar style, I want to ensure you that no audience faces are visible. This evening, we are so happy to create this space to discuss the amazing equal pay victory for the U.S. women's soccer team and hear from our guest panelists, including Jessica Ramey Sender from Equal Rights Advocates and Aileen Rizzle, who took her equal pay battle all the way to the Supreme Court and won. We will demystify equal pay because it can be complex. We'll talk about root causes. And finally, we'll give you some concrete action steps that you can take to ensure pay equity. So let's get started. We want to start with a few facts about equal pay that everyone should know. So it's my pleasure to introduce Linda Lee. She is the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC. Linda, please tell us a bit about the EEOC and the basics about equal pay.
Thanks so much, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for showing up tonight. I coordinate outreach and education for EEOC out of the San Francisco district, and our agency enforces the Equal Pay Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and the Lilly Ledbetter Act, among others, right? So we're the agency that enforces federal laws against employment discrimination. That includes harassment, and it includes wage discrimination, based not only on gender, which includes pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, but also race, color, religion, national origin, age, 40 plus, disability, as well as the intersection of those characteristics. There'll be more if you want to learn more about our agency in the handout. I want to emphasize what are our assumptions around equal pay. So I made a simple what, why, and when quiz. So hopefully you'll see in your, popping up on your screen, the poll. So my first question is what does 17 cents matter? Have we actually made progress? I have for your delectation 4 possible answers. Is it all lies, dang lies, and statistics? Is it March 15th is the earliest equal pay day yet? Is it 17 cents could add up to an average of somewhat like 10,000 per woman and compound over a lifetime? 4th answer, did you watch this movie? Okay, so let's review the answers. Well, please feel free to vote. If you see it up on your screen, you can vote for the answer you choose. I'm gonna review what I think of them. All right, so first of all, people talk about a statistic and having numbers mean anything. Let's be really clear. The gender gap, the gender pay gap is math, not myth. And I'm stealing that from AUW. Just because the wage gap is attributable to multiple factors does not mean the phenomenon doesn't exist, okay? So let's be clear, it exists for every age group and widens over a woman's lifetime. How else do you explain that 1 year after graduation, women earned 82% of what men with similar education and experience were earning? 10 years after graduation, that's 69% of what men were earning. We see it balloon over the course of a woman's work life, and it's widest, the gap is widest for women ages 55 to 64, just in time for retirement or not being able to retire the way you should be able to. It's even wider for women of color, mothers of young children, and women with disabilities. So let's look at answer B, right? Answer B, smaller gap in 2022. How much of that comes at the price of jobs lost during COVID, a burden that falls disproportionately on women and people of color? Women lost 11.9 million jobs and 4.4 million women left the labor force, largely due to caregiving responsibilities. Now let's go back to 17 cents and what it adds up to. According to the Center for American Progress, that answer of almost 10,000 per women or 407,000 plus over a 40-year career. These are calculations if women were paid an equal wage. So to quote my hero, Lilly Ledbetter, those pennies add up to real money, and they can cover student loans, mortgage, childcare, prescriptions and healthcare, groceries, emergency expenses, and of course, retirement. Answer D. If you watch the movie, then you'll see, right? What the women's soccer team shows us is that we're still fighting all the way into 2022, right? They didn't get their settlement till this year. It seems like the goalposts have moved from simply equal pay for equal work, but it's more along the lines of Olivia Pope's family motto, which is, you gotta be twice as good as them to get half of what they get paid, right? So I'm gonna move us, all right. Did I share the results of the poll? It looked like a lot of you were in line with what we're thinking, right? It's a fight and there's progress still to be made. So I'm gonna move us to my next question, which is why? Launching that question now. Why is there a pay gap? Is it A, biological superiority? Men have more ability, strength, and speed. Is it B, the choices that women are making and women aren't speaking up and asking for more? Is it C, that women's work is devalued? Or is it D, sex discrimination in pay, recruitment, job assignment, and promotion? I'm going to give people a little bit more time to vote. This time I'll think about, anybody else want to vote? You're welcome to. I'm going to, oh, I see a few more people coming in. I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to just share the results and talk about the answers. I'm so happy to see that nobody is picking A, except for the US soccer team as their first legal defense, right? Answer B. You hear this a lot. I think a lot of people believe, oh, it's the choices that women are making or that women aren't speaking up. But what kind of choices are we talking about? Was it like the women's union choosing a different pay structure than the men? Do women choose lower paying jobs and fewer hours? Let's say this, nobody claims that the entire wage gap is due to discrimination, but we can acknowledge that choices themselves can be framed by discrimination and social pressure, right? Also, the motherhood penalty, time you spend out of the workforce, leave you need to take, unpaid work. We see this represented in the sacrifices and the conflict that Jess McDonald suffers as she cares for her son and is an underpaid mother. And what happens if you ask? If you ask, you're labeled aggressive, demanding, a troublemaker, as we see from what happened with the heroes on screen with us today and in the movie. If you don't ask, also, it's your fault, right? So question C, women's work is devalued. Why is it that men dominate the top 20 highest paying jobs? 15 out of the top 20 highest paying jobs are dominated by men, whereas women dominate 14 of the 20 lowest paying jobs. Research suggests that segregation by occupation and industry is responsible for at least half of the wage gap, right? And studies show also that when women move into occupations in large numbers, think about school teachers, computer programmers, then those jobs begin paying less. And what about microaggressions, bullying, and outright illegal harassment that women experience often when they work in a male-dominated field? So that moves us naturally to my fourth answer, sex discrimination in pay, recruitment, job assignment, you name it, right? Women who negotiate salary are perceived as demanding. Women who are mothers are perceived to be less committed to the job, less dependable, and more emotional. And actually, you can't win ever because a recent Washington Post article cites a new study that shows single women can be perceived as too masculine and lacking the communal relational skills associated with women in couples who are raising children. So it looks like none of those things are desired in women. So here, for my question of why there is a pay gap, we'll have to say it's a complex mix of all of the above. And I'm deeming question or answer A as an example of the mansplaining and entrenched bias we face on top of all these other factors. So my final, oh, I didn't share the results. It looks like most people lean towards sex discrimination as well as job segregation, and to some degree, choices that women are making. But what kind of choices? All right, so my last question is when? When do you think we'll be done with the wage gap? And here are your possible answers. In 2059, in 2133, 2206, or 135.6 years from now. And I'm open to all answers. Feel free to go ahead and vote what you believe it to be. All right, anybody else want to vote? I'm gonna, a few more coming in. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So I see we have got votes in all of these things, and I'll tell you why you were right. For people who voted for 2059, this is a number that comes from the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and they assert that in 2059, women and men who are working full-time year-round, that's when they project parity. However, that number 2133, that would be correct because that's their projection for Black women achieving equality with white men. And sadly, 2206, that's the year they project for Latinas to make parity with white men. And for those of you, it looked like it was popular to say 135.6 years from now. That number comes to us from the World Economic Forum's 2021 Global Gender Gap Report. And it used to be that they were projecting 100 years from now, we close the worldwide gender gap. However, due to the pandemic, only 12 months of the pandemic it took to add 36 more years to that number. So thank you for acing the equal pay quiz. I'm now going to turn it over to Kelly Jenkins-Poltz, the Regional Administrator for the Women's Bureau, to introduce our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was a really fun poll and really good way to break down the equal pay myths. I am Kelly Jenkins-Poltz. I'm Regional Administrator for the Women's Bureau's regional office here in California. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a federal agency within the Department of Labor, and we focus on women's employment issues. We produce research and policy analysis. We offer grants to nonprofit organizations, and we host public events like the one we're having this evening to raise awareness about strategies that help women get good jobs, equal pay, and strong benefits. Linda referenced some of the report that we recently released. It's called Bearing the Cost, and it details how women, especially women of color, were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic crisis. The report finds that in 2019 alone, segregation by industry and occupation cost Black women an estimated $39.3 billion and Hispanic women an estimated $46.7 billion in lower wages compared to white men. The causes of occupational segregation are deep and they're widespread across our society, and they range from outright discrimination in hiring to subtle stereotypes and social norms that push women into particular fields of study and career pathways. In 2020, women saw more negative employment effects than men, in part because they were overrepresented in the occupations and industries that had the greatest job losses. Overall, occupational segregation contributes to a disproportionate number of women, and particularly women of color, who are concentrated in female-dominated jobs, which are devalued and pay lower wages compared to male-dominated jobs. But as we're going to discuss tonight, women earn less than men in nearly all occupations, even in jobs where women represent a majority of workers. Women's labor is so devalued that when women enter an occupation in large numbers, the wages go down. But you can find our report in an interactive graphic that details the gender wage gap by very specific occupations. You can look up your own occupation on our website, dol.gov/WB, and we'll put a link to that in our resource page for you. But tonight we have two special guests who are going to talk to us more about why the women's soccer team's equal pay saga is so relevant for all of us. Aileen Rizzo has spent 25 years working in education at all levels, striving to close academic achievement gaps, empowering communities to disrupt math anxiety, and promoting groups underrepresented in STEM fields. In 2012, Aileen began a fight for pay equity and became an advocate for the economic security of women in our state and throughout the country, working with legislators and advocates to pass some of the strongest pay equity bills in the nation. Currently, Aileen works as the Associate Director of the Ames Center for Math and Science and is also pursuing a PhD in STEM education. We're so glad you can join us tonight. Jessica Ramey Stender is Policy Director and Deputy Legal Director at Equal Rights Advocates, where she leads policy advocacy with a focus on pay equity, sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination, and education civil rights, and represents workers in employment discrimination cases. Jessica regularly writes and speaks about issues related to equal pay, sexual harassment, and gender equity. And very pertinent to this panel discussion, Jessica wrote an amicus brief on behalf of 22 organizations in support of Aileen Rizzo's equal pay case and argued in front of an en banc panel of the Ninth Circuit in her case. And to pose our first question to our panelists, I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer Fritzl.
Thank you, Kelly. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really excited to share this material with you. My name is Jennifer Fritzl. I'm a program analyst with the U.S. Department of Labor Women's Bureau. And I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the first question for Aileen and Jessica. Aileen, if you could please take the first question. You know, as we signed on to this meeting, you shared how much this documentary really resonated with you. And I think this first question would be great for you to get us started. What were your biggest takeaways from the LFG and which moments stood out to you most?
Well, definitely when I was watching, my heart was just really in awe of how much we have in common. So one of the things is just the excuses. And here I am in education, academics, and it's your fault for some reason, like you didn't do something right. For them, it was they already had accepted and negotiated for a contract. Be grateful. I was told the same thing. I remember being in the HR meeting and told that my prior salary was so low, but they still gave me step one. Like, how grateful should I be that I got to step one, even though that wasn't equal? And then the argument that for some it wasn't happening. So in my case, that's what they tried. They tried to find some woman somewhere that was making more than a man in her department, and somehow that, you know, like washed away anything that else was happening. And when that happened to the women's soccer team, and they were told, well, some of you are making more, it feels like they're really not listening, and they're really just trying to get away with it. They're trying to figure out how to get away with it, not make it right. And as though if you discriminate against some people, that's okay, as long as you're not discriminating against everyone. And so it really feels almost, in a way, comical, but really heartbreaking that some of these arguments are still used. No matter what field the woman is in, she's still going to hear some of those same things. And the idea, I remember Judy Foudy in the documentary said, just be grateful, you know, and that kind of feeling is just really, it really kind of narrows down that you are fighting for your value. And historically, like, this is the way we've always done it. I was told this is the way we've always done it. We just looked at people's prior salary. But the question of whether or not that's good for everyone, and the assumption that made that we all come from equal paths, that we all have equal standing. If you're all coming from these equal places, then looking for your past salary might work. But that we know that that's not true. And so I think I was just really in awe of just a lot of the similarities that were going on. The mom with her little boy, I felt the same way. Like, when my 3 children, and looking at them and knowing that if I didn't do anything, nothing else is going to change. Like, this is still going to go on. And for the women's soccer team, that had gone on since the team started. And so that was kind of a lot of similarities I was seeing between my own journey and their own. And it's heartbreaking, but it's out there, it's happening. And I'm so glad that they had the courage to keep going.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aileen, for sharing that. And, you know, thank you for your courage to keep on going. I mean, that must have been a very challenging road for you, but we're really happy that you're here to share your story with us. Jessica, what about you? What were your biggest takeaways from the documentary, and what moments stood out most to you?
So there were several. First of all, I thought it was a very impactful documentary. I think, you know, Linda referenced this, but the excuses that the Soccer Federation tried to make for justifying or trying to justify paying women less than men for doing the same thing, playing soccer, really resonated with me because it's what we see in a variety of other equal pay contexts and cases. And so for, as a reminder, the Soccer Federation initially stated in a court document that it is undisputed that the job of a men's national team player requires materially more strength and speed than the job of women's national team players. And it also, in that court filing, said that the male team players carry more responsibility than the women's team players. And he later, the president apologized for that, but we see, you know, the essence of equal pay laws, they vary, federal and state laws, but the essence is equal pay for equal or substantially equal work. And if an employer is paying someone less, let's say a woman less than a man, for doing the same or substantially same work, they have to have a legal justification. And it is true that if they are actually doing materially different work, or there's different responsibility or skill involved, that can be a legal justification. But often employers are pointing to differences that really are not actually accurate. And in this case, pretty obviously inaccurate, in that they are literally playing the same sport. And in fact, the women were often doing better. So that kind of just really resonated with me as the types of arguments that we hear employers make to try to justify unlawful wage gaps. You know, I thought the other big takeaway was the kind of clear emotional toll that both the effect of equal pay violations or being paid less than your male counterparts has on a real a literal level, in terms of not having the resources that you need to provide for your child, to provide childcare, to cover other living necessities. And we saw that with the story of one player's, the single mother who was trying to support her son. And, you know, we hear a lot of arguments, oh, why you're still talking about the wage gap, it's just a few cents. But as Linda really, I think, helpfully explained, it really adds up, and it takes away from families' ability to pay for rent, diapers, food, childcare. And so I think just seeing that play out for people is really important, to see the actual impact. And then also, I thought the emotional impact. And, you know, Aileen, we all are just, you know, in awe of your bravery of speaking out in your equal pay situation. But the emotional impact that I know that took on you, seeing it on the players, of having to justify yourself and your worth to, you know, your employer, to a court, to the world, takes a real emotional toll. And it's hard for workers to step forward. And that's why people like Aileen and others and the soccer team is so critical to stand up and try to say, no, we're going to assert our value and ensure that employers are complying with their obligations. And on just that note, I'll add, you know, the soccer players in this film, of course, are much more high profile. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there are significant risks for workers speaking out. And I think having being aware that the significant fears of retaliation that exist is really just an important takeaway that exists at all wage levels, but especially for low wage workers that don't have kind of the means that higher wage workers may have to absorb some of those risks, is a real one. And it's one that I think we have retaliation laws, but we need to really think strongly about making them stronger and more robust, to ensure that workers really can come forward about their equal pay violations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. There is that part in the documentary where Megan takes the young girl's hand, and she's like, I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it for her. And, you know, that's just really powerful. So thank you both for your advocacy and this, you know, the equal pay, and for being here. I will now turn it over to Ruth.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists and to Linda for showing us the toll that equal pay takes, and how widespread it is, and how devastating it really is. I'm the supervising attorney of the Catherine and George Alexander Community Law Center's Workers' Rights Clinic at Santa Clara University Law School. It's a long name. We're on the Alameda, so we're local, and we do discrimination, wage theft, equal pay cases. And I also supervise a legal advice line through the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement of Santa Clara County, and we have attorneys who will answer your questions at no charge in English, Spanish, Tagalog, Visayan, Vietnamese, and Mandarin. So I want to share the great progress that we've made in California related to equal pay. In California, employers cannot ask about previous pay during the hiring process. Employees can talk about their salaries and do not have to keep it confidential. That's been true for a long time, but it was reiterated in California Fair Pay Act. Again, and the state of California prohibits employers from incorporating non-disclosure agreements. Additionally, the Fair Pay Act, it isn't just for gender, it's more intersectional, and it also deals with race or ethnicity-based wage differences. It enforces that law, and it eliminates the requirement that the jobs that are compared must be located at the same establishment. And it explicitly replaces equal work with substantially similar work. So they could be different jobs. These laws help close the gender pay gap and promote economic security for women. But of course, we still have a long way to go, as you've seen. So I next want to turn to a panelist, Aileen, again. And I know you've answered some of this, but during the film, the female athletes were not only doing the same job as men, but they were outperforming them. How does that mirror your own experience? And why did it take so long for the women's soccer team to get equal pay? And I'm assuming it took a long time for you as well.
Yeah, definitely. So that's one way that it was really mirrored in what the women's soccer team did. I mean, they're phenomenal. Individually and as a team, they have reached the highest of highest levels. And for me, at the time that I had found out about this pay inequity, I don't think I was as aware of what it was like to be a woman of color who was a mathematician. Like, I had known that I didn't see a lot of people looking like me in classes and so on and so forth, but you kind of get used to it. But then when this happens to you, you realize that that difference wasn't just a difference. It was a discrepancy of life that needs to change. Like, there should be more that look like me. So why isn't there? And then if you go through the barriers of enduring maybe discrimination in classes or just not feeling like you belong in them, so on and so forth, is what's waiting for you on the other side is just to be grateful you made it that far, or to be paid less. We encourage girls to go in STEM fields, but is that what's waiting for them on the other side? It really can't be. And so my qualifications were higher than my male colleague. So my male colleague was just hired, so I had more seniority. He didn't have a master's degree and I was finishing my second, and had more experience in education. So I had been a high school teacher. So I had secondary mathematics courses that I'd taken, and he had been an elementary teacher, which is not a bad thing. But in the math department, having more mathematics classes makes you better adapted or flexible to teach all levels. And so when I found out there was this discrepancy, I honestly thought it has to be a mistake. Like, there's some little clerical error that happened. And when I go let them know this, they'll quickly fix it. It's just, you are just blown away. I saw that on the women's face as they're interviewing them after they went into mediation, and they were just blown away with the excuses and that they were so far apart. And I was blown away as well. I remember in this scenario, even in the scenario of what I might make, I still was put at a lower step than this new colleague. Like, I still deserved, even if it was 2 or 3 steps lower, where he got step 9 and I started at 1, which was a huge discrepancy. Even in the scenario that they made up, I was still around 7 or 8. And so each of those things that happen to you is really an emotional and personal thing. I mean, you're dealing with an employer that has deeper pockets and no emotional ties to what's going on, but just like many of the players said, this was an emotional journey and took a lot of energy on so many levels, because you had your job and all of your responsibilities, and then you had this lawsuit, and there was always a threat, like, was I going to lose my job, or are they going to countersue me, like all of these things that were happening. And in my case, there was other women that it was happening to, and I know that because when the Fair Pay Act was signed, I got equal pay for the last 6 months of my time there. And I know other women who got raises. So if you were getting a raise because it got restructured because of new HR laws, that's kind of what the email said, then that means you weren't getting paid fairly. And so although I had reached out to a few women that I knew, it takes a lot to put that on the line, and they just weren't ready to do that. So in one way, it would have been great to have someone else to walk this walk with, and it still makes it hard. And the soccer team had each other, and that was great that they had each other. Why does it take so long? I don't know. John Lewis called it good trouble, when you're making good trouble, and when you talk out or confront these kind of social justice, equity, equality issues, you're not the most favorite person at first. You're making waves, and you're making people feel uncomfortable. And when you walk in the room, everyone stops talking, and it's because they were talking about you or what they saw in the newspaper, or what they saw in the news last night. And it is a change that has to happen, because that uncomfortable feeling, you got to step into it for the change to happen. But true change happens a little at a time. I mean, where we're talking about case law in my situation, the use of prior salary had never really been completely looked at in this district. And so there's so many different levels. Had Lily Ledbetter not taken her fight, I would have never had a case, because I didn't know until my 4th year of employment that I had been paid wrongly all these years. And so that act that her fight allowed gave me a chance or a day in court. And so even though she didn't win ultimately, right? So even though there are these other battles that are happening, and we don't necessarily cross each other, a pathway, the advances that each of those is working towards do matter. And so that's why it's really important. I mean, change takes a long time. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the dissent that she wrote for Lily Ledbetter, and then President Obama, signing that. I mean, all of these pieces were going to intersect to my case. And now prior salary is not an excuse to pay a woman less. It should have never been. But I'm learning more and more that some employers want to obey the letter of the law, but not the intent. Because if they were obeying the intent, then the Equal Pay Act should have worked, right? But there's a lot of pieces in there where you can maneuver, and that's why it takes so long. You have to define what equal pay means. What does equal mean in a job? Does it, and so all of these things have to be fleshed out, because the first time that laws get enacted doesn't always do what it needs to do. And so that's why it's so important. People say, we don't need more laws, we don't need more. Well, if this is going on still, then we need to do some refining. As a STEM person in engineering, you have prototypes, and then you have lots of iterations before you get it right. And that's the same thing with advocacy work. We have to keep going and trying to get it right. It's not always right the first time, and usually it's not. And so just having that perseverance, I saw that from the women's team. They were already brave. They were already women of courage, and they already had perseverance in the athletic field, but they brought those same values over to advocacy, and look what they did. So it's amazing.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Aileen. My name is Peg Carlson Bowen, and I'm with the American Association of University Women, or AAUW. We are a national, state, and local alumni organization. We welcome graduates from any college. And talking about perseverance, we have supported and advocated for women and girls since 1881 through education, advocacy, and research. starting with our first study of the wage gap of federal workers in 1913. We continue to fight for equal pay with our legal advocacy fund, which in fact helped finance Aileen's case and also Lily Ledbetter's case. And equal pay really is our primary focus. My question is for Jessica. The film is about the U.S. women's soccer team fight for equal pay. It's a high-profile case. Can you tell us how wage discrimination shows up for women in other types of professions and other cases, including Aileen's?
Sure. So I think the high profile nature of this case was a very good thing, because I know we're all, the nerds who think about equal pay and equal pay laws and developments in the law and what types of legal defenses work. But I think it really, this case in particular and others like it, really helped to increase public awareness about the types of equal pay issues that women, and particularly women of color, face, and really kind of drive home the injustice of equal pay violations. And as I mentioned before, in this case, it was just so obviously unfair in that they are literally playing the same sport. And so I think the high profile nature of these types of cases is really good in that way, to really bring this awareness. But as you mentioned, we know that women in all professions and all wage levels experience wage discrimination. We often see questions come up in terms of the types of cases that are brought about whether, first of all, the woman and man are actually doing equal or substantially equal work. And that can really be a question of, of course, looking at what skill, what effort, what responsibility is required in each of the jobs. And that's often a question that's going to be litigated. We do know, though, that kind of minor differences are not sufficient to justify a wage disparity. Job titles are not indicative. So an employer can't say, well, he's the vice president of, whatever, and she's just an employee. If they're doing the same or substantially similar work, that's what matters. So those are some of the kind of questions that come up in the case. And then also the question is whether, if you've established that a man and a woman are performing substantially equal work, or in California, substantially similar, whether the employer can show that there is some non-sex-based reason for that pay disparity, that gender-based pay disparity. And so some of the types of cases we see, including in Aileen's, is whether an employer can, for example, base pay and justify a pay disparity on prior salary. And we've talked some about that question that was, as you've heard, settled at least here in the Ninth Circuit in Aileen's case. But really, if we take a step back and think about these numbers that Linda was talking about of perpetual wage discrimination in essentially virtually every industry and occupation in this country, and we know that it exists almost across the board, then we also know that this seemingly innocuous question, what did you make in your last job, that I think most of us, at least I know in every job interview I think I've ever had, has been asked of me and employers for years. That was just their standard way of operating. That makes sense of why that question actually is completely unfair and really just perpetuates these wage discrimination patterns. So if you're earning less in your prior job, you will just perpetuate those gender and race-based pay gaps. So that issue has been litigated in a variety of circuits, and unfortunately, there is a split. So some circuits, federal court circuit courts have said that prior salary can sometimes be a legal justification, but as we have talked about and celebrated today, at least in the Ninth Circuit, because of Aileen's case, prior salary cannot be used to justify any portion of a wage differential, which is a very important holding, of course. But in addition to the kinds of cases that I just mentioned, which are really kind of Equal Pay Act violations, paying a man more or a woman more for performing substantially similar work, other types of wage discrimination that we see come up for workers have to do with discrimination in hiring or promotions that lead a woman potentially to earn less than a man. So let's say an employer decides that the man is really more fit for the kind of prime area of sales, if they're making sales, because he just seems to be a better fit for that. And that's why he's earning less than the woman. If there's some discrimination in their decision of putting the man in that kind of higher earning region, that can be a potentially different type of wage discrimination, usually under our more traditional discrimination laws like Title VII at the federal level and the Fair Employment and Housing Act here in California. So we also see wage discrimination come up in that way. Women not being promoted into higher paid positions or having assumptions made about them because of their parenting or caregiving responsibilities, such that an employer might determine that they are not worth as much. So those types of wage discrimination cases also come up and are often kind of litigated under separate laws, but are equally, of course, harmful and contribute to that broader wage gap. And then finally, I'll just say in terms of the types of cases that we see, the Federal Equal Pay Act only applies to sex-based pay disparities and only prohibits sex-based pay disparities for substantially equal work. But some states, including California and others, have expanded our state equal pay laws to cover other protected classes. So for example, here in California, we also cover race and ethnicity, meaning that we here in California have cases that involve not just pay disparities based on sex, but also race-based disparities. And I think it's critical that in a case like Aileen, where you might have a Latina or a Black woman or a Mexican woman who the pay discrimination and experience may have been based on both race and sex, and you often can't separate that out in a person. So it really kind of addresses the intersectional nature that we often see of equal pay violations. So that's kind of the last trend I'll mention in terms of wage discrimination we see.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Good evening to everybody who's joined us today. My name is Leah Carpio Hernandez, and I'm also with the Women's Bureau. The question that I have is for both Aileen and Jessica. The players in the film continually mention that the case is more about future generations of soccer players and women across the world. What are you doing in your community to improve conditions for future generations? And where do you see the need for change for future generations? Let's go ahead and start with Aileen.
Thank you. So like I mentioned before, I wasn't necessarily aware of the impact that I could have. So in the midst of this journey, which was 8 years, so 2012 is when I found out, and then 8 years later was when the Supreme Court decided not to take the case and review it again, was a time of really change for me completely. I had never been as civically involved as I should have been. I had never been ever in front of legislators to ever talk in front of them. I try to tell people I'm literally the quietest one in the classroom. So anyone in education have those really quiet ones that you forget about because they're just doing everything and they're not making a ruckus. I was literally the one that wanted to just be invisible in the class. I became a teacher, but presenting in front of students was totally different. When I came to the job that I had there at the county office, I was teaching teachers, and I still felt okay and comfortable with people, doing the job that I love. So when I was first asked to testify and to start just sharing my story, that's pretty much it. You have like 2 or 3 minutes in front of the legislative committee to try to share what's happening to you. And I started understanding how significant it was because of the excuses. So the excuses were, well, women aren't getting high degrees, and that's why they're not making a lot of money. Well, here was a woman who did. Okay, so women aren't in fields that are lucrative, like the STEM fields. Well, here's a woman who was. So even in education, where you think there's like this pay scale and it's so, transparent, it was still happening. So that's why it was so important to tell my story. And I wrote it down, and I was really nervous, but I think advocacy has really been now part of who I am, and being civically engaged, because I think for a long time I thought, well, I'm in education, I'm not in politics. But you can be in any other field and not be political, and in education of all places. So I always try to share with teachers now that we don't have to separate who we are in the places that we hold values to, and being political and knowing who is going to represent you is so important. So I think that just continuing advocacy letting a person know I'm there for them. So if I ever hear of someone who is taking on a social justice issue or something that's unjust, if I ever have that opportunity, just to let them know that I'm there and I believe in them. When I was there at the county office for those 8 years, it gradually got more difficult and more difficult. But there were people who were at least bold enough to come and whisper in my ear, I'm there for you. Like, that's wrong what they're doing. And it meant something to have people come alongside me and say, I'm there with you. And that ended up happening more in the advocacy. So AUW came alongside and helped me with fees, court fees. And I got to meet amazing people like Jessica and Mariko and so many other people who I just admire the work that they do, because I would just be in awe of saying, well, these people are like working for me and I have no idea that they're doing this work for me. And so it was a privilege and an honor to stand shoulder to shoulder with some amazing warriors for equality and be there and do at least what I could, which was just share your story, just tell them your story, Aileen. And that's how it can start. Just sharing what's happening to you and being a little bit more transparent about that. Take time to be educated. So that is so important. Be educated about your rights, be educated about the strategies that you can use. Later on, I had another issue that came up after I was still in the midst of the equal pay, but had another HR issue. And it was so phenomenal to be able to call someone who is an employment lawyer and say, what if this is happening? What can I do? And there are people out there who are willing to share their knowledge, but we just don't tap into it. And there's so many resources there. So just be knowledgeable about what your rights are. I think that is so important, to just know them and be knowledgeable and try to keep up. And then never rest. I think we've learned that we cannot rest on our laurels, that we cannot say, oh, we won that, we're good to go, because anything is up for a risk and we can take a step backwards. So we have to know that we have to make some forward momentum, even if it's small steps, because we can't just rest and think that things are done. And I think that's the danger of future generations, to think, well, they did it, and so it should be okay now. No, we still have to keep moving toward justice for everyone. And then I think the last thing I would say is, one of the things that was daunting to me is that I was able to have a lawsuit that maybe a lot of women wouldn't have been able to do that. So in the fact that, yes, I was taking a risk, but I had the resources to have a retainer and to start that process. And so I wish that it was more accessible, because the easiest thing would have been to just walk away, to say, oh, then I quit and I'm going to go get another job. But to just take the courage of that one moment and say, I'm going to do something about it, then you have to always make that decision, because every step of the way is another curve. And that's what the soccer women showed us, that even when they made some progress, there was another curve thrown in there, and they had to decide, are we going to keep going? Are we still going to keep advancing? Are we really in this to the end? And I think that's really hard, because I wish it was more accessible. I wish that the path to justice was a little bit more accessible to people, because it feels so daunting and so overwhelming sometimes to think about everything you're pouring into it and how long it takes to even get an answer, or to be thrown a curveball and saying, okay, are you going to risk it again? Because now they're saying this and now they're doing this. And it's hard. It really is hard. So I hope that in future generations, we could just make it more accessible. My greatest wish is that employers would just do the right thing. But until that happens, to hold them accountable takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy. So standing side by side and just trying to help people be knowledgeable and to just be educated about their rights, I think is really important.
Great. Jessica, did you have anything to add to the question?
Sure. So The work that I do as the policy director at ERA is, of course, policy and legislative work. And so that focus really is on augmenting and making more robust our equal pay laws. At the federal level, the Equal Pay Act has not been amended since it was enacted. So in many ways, it has some gaps that need to be filled. And there are efforts to do that through legislation at the federal level, Paycheck Fairness Act, but they have not been successful thus far. So a lot of what we do is advocacy and policy change here in California and supporting people in other states trying to strengthen our equal pay laws to better address the contributors to the gender and race-based wage gaps that we know, as we've been talking about, take such a toll on women and on families and really on the overall economy. We know that a major contributor to the wage gap is the lack of transparency around pay. And traditionally, and still often now, there has been kind of a taboo nature to talking about pay. People don't feel comfortable discussing it, don't feel comfortable asking about it. In some situations, employers will actually have a rule, often referred to as a pay secrecy rule, to say employees can't discuss wages. And I believe this was mentioned before, but one of the actions that we've taken in California was to make that unlawful. Employers can no longer in California make it, have a rule or a policy in place saying workers can't talk about pay and they can't retaliate against workers from discussing it. And that's huge because we know that so often workers are not aware, a woman won't be aware of the fact that she's being substantially underpaid until some error. I think with Aileen, you heard someone just mentioned it kind of offhandedly. I think with Lily Ledbetter, someone left a note, an anonymous note on her desk. Often a worker will just see a file left out accidentally and discover a glaring disparity between them and their often male counterparts, even though they do the same job. And so ensuring that we do have that openness to discuss pay is huge. And so in terms of the community, the work we're doing is to ensure that workers know about their rights to talk about pay and that they can't be retaliated against, in addition to other equal pay rights that they have. And on that note, we often see that workers who are experiencing equal pay violations often have other workplace violations going on. So we also advocate in strengthening stronger sexual harassment protections, other forms of discrimination, trying to limit the use of NDAs, which often silence workers from speaking out about equal pay and other workplace rights violations. So those are the types of things we advocate for, and in addition to straight equal pay advocacy. And another kind of, and this goes into the future generation question, another type of work that we do, and many on this call do, is trying to address that trend that Linda touched on and Kelly of occupational segregation, that we know women make up the vast majority of low wage and minimum wage workers in this country, in this state. And that is a major contributor to the overall wage gap. I think it's one of the largest, if I recall correctly from your presentation. So in addition to fighting for equal pay and combating pay discrimination between, let's say, a man and a woman doing the same job, we also are working to try to increase women's access into traditionally male-dominated, often better paid fields. One example of that, which I'm so honored to get to work with Kelly and others at the Women's Bureau and EEOC and others agencies that do this, is trying to increase women's jobs in the construction trades. They have been and continue to be extremely male dominated. I believe it's about 93% still. And we know that those are jobs that often allow a worker to actually live, pay their bills, have a pension, support a family, and they really have been traditionally and still are often held by men. So helping to get women into those jobs, and that means getting them into the pathways into those jobs. So into pre-apprenticeship programs, apprenticeship programs, where you actually on the job learning to learn a trade, to then be able to get a job in those trades. So that's kind of the final piece I'd touch on the community work that we're doing with so many partners here and elsewhere, is to try to break down the barriers that women, particularly women of color, have faced to getting into those higher paid jobs, such that we can address the gender wage gap through that prong or through that strategy, in addition to equal pay advocacy.
Thank you both. My name is Hee-Jung Atkins, and I'm the Pacific Region's Director of Planning and Support at the Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP. OFCCP is a civil rights agency that evaluates the employment practices of companies doing business with the federal government. We conduct compliance evaluations of contractors' employment practices, from hiring to termination, to ensure that they're not engaging in unlawful employment discrimination based on race, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, national origin, disability, or status as a protected veteran, and that they're complying with our affirmative action requirements. OFCCP has made combating pay discrimination by contractors an enforcement priority because despite the existing laws of protecting workers from gender-based compensation discrimination for more than 5 decades, as mentioned, the pay gap between men and women still persists today, and these gaps are even more stark between women of color and for women of color and for women with disabilities. And related to compensation discrimination work is our enforcement of the pay transparency provision of the Executive Order 1124-6. And this is similar to what Jessica was mentioning, because research shows that among the possible contributing factors to the enduring pay gap is the prevalence of workplace prohibitions on discussing compensation. The amendment to Executive Order 1124-6 now prohibits contractors from discriminating against applicants or employees because they've inquired about, discussed, or disclosed their compensation, or subject to certain limitations. So the next question I have is also for both of our panelists. What would you encourage others to do to fight wage discrimination? And is there any pending California legislation relating to pay equity, and how can we follow it? Let's go to Aileen first, and then Jessica.
Thank you. I mentioned a little bit about this, but number one, vote good representation for yourself who care about these issues that you care about. Definitely hold your representation accountable. If they're already in office, hold them accountable, ask them how they're voting on bills that are around pay equity or equality and that are important to you. See their voting record. That's so important to just, keep knowledgeable and make sure that our representation is representing us. We really need to break stereotypes and recognize our own biases. And so if I Google mathematician on my computer, I'm not going to see very many women, and I'm probably not going to see a woman that looks like me. But that's not true. And so we do belong in those spaces, and we do belong in spaces everywhere, right? And so we need to break down our own stereotypes, our own biases, and really try to help the next generation see themselves belonging in all the spaces that have not traditionally been held by them. I think that that's so important. I tell young women, especially who are going into STEM fields, to know their value, to know how much they're worth, their experience, their education, try to look for resources so that when they're going on those interviews, that they'll be established about what they should ask for, what they should, how they should come into that with pay and salary in mind. I have the privilege of mentoring student teachers who are becoming math teachers. And I also have a special place in my heart for the Latina women who I get to mentor in that space, because I see in them who I was, and I see in them the future of what they could be. And so I always want them to know that when they walk in a room and they're the math teacher, like I was walking in the room and I was the math coach, that didn't always fit the stereotypes. Like, you're the math coach, and I looked like some of them sitting in the room. And I remember one time walking into remedial math class, and the teacher was completely opposite of me, a male, young, white male. But I was completely the demographic of almost his entire class. That broke my heart. And I was like, has anybody noticed this? But then I thought to myself, what, just walking into the room, what change did I make, right? Because their math coach looked like their teacher's math coach looked like them. And so we need to break down those stereotypes. We need to encourage the next generations to just be to know their value. Being transparent, I think that we talked a little bit about this. There's still things about not sharing your pay. I found out in a lunch discussion that just, a discussion that was happening at the same table. But I find it hard for myself to say it sometimes, but I know that having lived it, if I had known any sooner, if someone had talked to me about it, that it would have been something that would have been on my radar, or I would have known that information. So just being transparent, it's not something that we're still comfortable with, but I think that we know that if we don't say anything, that there's things happening in secret that shouldn't be happening and that aren't fair. I can't tell you how many Me Too stories I've heard of all the privilege and honors I've had to share my story again and again. So many women have come up to me at all ages telling me Me Too stories, but it really makes a difference to share your story. Even if you quit and got another job, or some other remedy was your remedy or solution, just telling your story, because then we don't feel like we're alone. There are spaces and times that I felt like I'm alone. Am I the only one that this is happening to? And so that could be really discouraging. And so just sharing your story is so important, and letting us all know that, we're not alone in this, that we're doing this together. We're making these advances together. So yeah, those are some of the things that I would share just to fight wage discrimination. I'll let Jessica talk about policy and bills that are upcoming.
Yeah, so we're lucky to live in a state where there is a lot of activity, as Ruth discussed earlier, in terms of strengthening our equal pay laws, but we know they need to continue to be strengthened. And I saw the question in the chat about SB 973, which was a bill that we passed a couple years ago, in case anyone didn't see the chat, which requires employers in California that have at least 100 employees, 100 or more employees, they have to now collect pay data, aggregate pay data from their companies, broken down by race, gender, ethnicity, and job category. And they have to report that pay data to our state anti-discrimination enforcement agency, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, the state counterpart to the EEOC. And that data, pay data reporting law that we did here in California really was modeled after an effort at the federal level that had been enacted by the EEOC under the Obama administration, but was not surprisingly taken away in the subsequent Trump administration. I don't work for the government, so I say that on my own behalf. But it was taken away under the Trump administration, and so we did that in California. And I think what's exciting about that is that we have our first year of reporting done. The companies that had to report did. And even though under the current law, the information is confidential, it just goes to the state agency, the DFEH. The DFEH is allowed to publish aggregate reports, so not individually identifiable by company, if they want to, and they did. So it's really interesting to see, if you go to the DFEH website, and we can circulate the link after, the report that they issued based on the pay data shows exactly what we expected it to show, which is that in companies, the overrepresentation of women and people of color in lower paid jobs and lower job bands and pay bands, and overrepresentation of men and white people in the higher paid jobs. And that is the goal of that bill. And at the federal level, the goal of the rule at the EEOC that was in place for a moment was to, one, help employers even uncover this type of kind of occupational segregation that they may not even have been aware of. If you're a very large company, you have a lot of different people making hiring and pay decisions. If you're not stepping back and doing a pay audit and taking that kind of bird's eye view, you may not even be aware. I mean, arguably you should be, but a lot of employers may not even be aware of those types of trends. And so seeing that data themselves can help incentivize them to say, hey, we need to make some changes to our recruitment, our promotion, our pay practices to ensure not only that we are paying people equally for the same job, but also that we have women and people of color represented at all wage levels. And actually, I wanted to note one very interesting kind of example of that was Intel, the company, chose to publish its EEO1 data, pay data, even though they didn't have to. And they put it on their website and laid it out and said, we recognize we have a problem. We are making changes. We are investing in changes to our outreach and promotion and recruitment practices to ensure that we address these patterns of occupational segregation. So the goal was that to help employers themselves identify and hopefully correct either unfair or sometimes unlawful pay disparities or representation of workers, but also to ensure that our agencies have the data to help with affirmative enforcement of our anti-discrimination and equal pay laws. So I think that we are seeing that it has been successful and will continue to be, in that it gives our agency more information to enforce our laws, but also will help employers see where they need to make change. And on the kind of second question of pending legislation, there is a current bill right now, SB 1162, that was introduced by Senator Monique Limon. I just, in full transparency, our organization is one of the co-sponsors of that bill, and that is currently moving through the legislature, and that would expand on the law that I just mentioned in a few ways. It would require that the employers in the state that have at least 100 or more contract workers, so not independent contractors, but temporary workers hired through third-party staffing agencies, if they have at least 100 or more of those temporary workers, they have to also collect and report pay data on those workers. And that's a really big issue that is kind of increasingly becoming more understood, that large companies are relying more and more on staffing agencies to hire their workers. So you'll have, let's say, a company like Google, which they have their direct employees, but they also hire workers through staffing agencies. And they, in fact, have more temporary workers hired through those staffing agencies than direct workers. And oftentimes the direct workers get paid more, have better benefits than the temporary workers, even though they're doing the exact same job. And we know from studies that have been done that those temporary workers are more often women, people of color, LGBTQI. So it really is a gender and racial justice issue, equal pay issue as well. So this bill would bring some transparency to that. And then it would also require that those pay data reports are made public. So right now, as I mentioned, they are confidential. They just go to the state agency. This would be somewhat similar to what other countries like the UK, Denmark, and some others have done, where companies actually have to, the pay data has to be public. So you would actually see broad, not individually identifiable by worker, but broad gender and race-based pay disparities by company, which we think is an important step to ensuring that companies are held accountable to make changes when necessary. And then finally, it would require in companies to, in their job postings, include the salary range for a position. We know that when workers are armed with information about what the possible salary is, it gives them, particularly women, more information to better negotiate higher pay. So that is the goal there. And then finally, it's a big bill. It would require that employers make known to their employees any opportunities for promotions before making a decision. So the goal there is to try to address what we see as sometimes happening of discriminatory kind of a tap on the shoulder to the employee you think is fit for a promotion, which sometimes can lead to discrimination and who gets a promotion. So this would ensure that all workers are made aware of an opportunity so that they can apply if they want before an employer makes a decision. So that is one kind of big pending bill here in California.
I put the pay data reporting in the chat, the aggregate data.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Jessica, for that information. And Aileen, thank you so much for sharing how important it is to normalize the conversation about pay. I'd like to try to engage with our audience a little bit more. I'd like to invite you to put some questions. I noticed some of you using the chat. You may also use the Q&A function on this webinar so we can get your questions. And if you don't have any questions, maybe you can reflect back on the film. Tell us what resonated with you the most after watching the film. And what is one thing that you are going to share with a friend or a family member, a daughter or a niece, or even other children, maybe your son as well. So tell us a little bit about what's resonating with you. We're happy to take some questions. And while we wait for the question, Jessica, let me pose another one to you. So you talked about some bills ERA was supporting for the state of California. What about at the federal level? What's the Biden administration doing to support pay equity?
So the Biden administration is doing a lot, including through various agencies represented here, and it's really exciting to see that. I think I've never seen such a strong focus from an administration. So some exciting kind of updates on that end is that President Biden signed an executive order, and I'll put the link in the chat, on advancing economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in federal contracting by promoting pay equity and transparency. It's a comprehensive executive order name, and essentially it requires that the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council, in consultation with the Secretary of Labor, considers ways to limit or prohibit federal contractors or subcontractors from using salary history in setting pay or making employment decisions. So as we've discussed, this kind of reliance on salary history that we see as often in many employment situations just serves to perpetuate gender and race-based wage gaps. So this is a really important step forward to limiting, or in some cases prohibiting, that through the executive order with regard to federal contractors. And there was also through OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, a proposed regulation that would address the use of salary history in hiring and pay setting for federal employees. So this is a kind of key issue that we see in the private workforce, but also in the federal workforce as well. So those are some of the actions that I wanted to highlight for you all, and I will put some of the links here in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. And again, inviting the audience to drop in your questions. Aileen, let me turn to you for a second. You know, you've shared so beautifully your struggle and how it has impacted you at the time, and really your outlook on life now, becoming that advocate. But still, folks may find it to be pretty scary to take on, you know, a case questioning their employer. They may be fearful of retaliation despite the laws that are in place to prevent this. So how did you develop that courage to take on your equal pay case?
That's a huge question. So when I look back on these stories, and I didn't know completely the whole story until I'd watched this documentary of the national soccer women's team. And I've been a big fan. I've gone to Portland to see them and to Boston to see them. And I saw that once again, these warriors for equality are made in the small moments. I remember John Lewis told a story of him being little in the movie theater, and he came back home and he said, "Mom, why do I have to sit somewhere different?" And Lily Ledbetter, when she got that note from her locker, that moment that she was reading it, you know. So when the soccer team said that someone called a meeting, that meeting was the start. So these paths and these journeys, sometimes that, you know, Lily Ledbetter, or these great stories that inspire us, they're made in the small moments. So my small moment was walking back from my meeting with HR, walking into my door, and my 3 young daughters coming to say, "Hi, Mom, you're back from work," and greeting me. And it was in that moment where I realized that the workforce that was waiting for them was impacted by the choices that I made. Now, I would be livid if this was my daughter and this was happening to her. But for myself, I might just say, "Oh, I'll just quit." But my choices in the workplace impact them and what they will have to endure. And so that small moment of them just greeting me like they always did was different that day because of what was happening to me. And so I think that whatever courage we find, or however we find it, it's going to be in that small moment. It's not going to be, you know, this grandiose, you know, speech we give in front of thousands of people. It's going to be in that small moment where we just decide that we're going to do something about it. You know, Rosa Parks talks about, she just got tired. She just got tired, and her tiredness was her small moment. I'm just tired of having to to do this stuff. And so I think that every one of us are going to have those small moments, and we can make them. And we have to still be honest with ourselves about what that might cost us. And I'm honest to any, I have a lot of young women who've come to me and said, this is happening, what should I do? And I'll be honest to them about what it might cost, what it might be on the line. But I think we all know that when we stand up for ourselves, we stand up for others also. And so that reality of it may be enough for us to do something about it. But I always tell them what it might look different, what you do about it than what someone else does about it. So if you decide to do something about it, do it the way you want to do it. It might not be filing a lawsuit. It might be writing a letter or making a phone call or having a meeting, but you can still do something and let it be something that you're willing to do. And I think that if we can have more of those engagements, then they'll be so powerful. I had shared before that things are changing and we are becoming the bosses that we had hoped for. And so as we become the bosses, and as diversity spreads and underrepresentation goes away and there's better representation in these spaces and in board meetings and CEOs, then let us be those people who are human-centered and have those values that allow companies like Intel to be transparent and to say, this is what we're doing, and we see our mistakes, and we're Salesforce. I mean, they also did that, seeing the mistakes and being willing to fix it before anyone has to go through all this mess and file a lawsuit, just because it's the right thing to do. And so that's a future that I hope for, and for anyone who wants to find the courage to do something, just to inspire them and give them that encouragement to do but their best, and for us to all of us together to walk this journey.
Beautifully said. Yeah, there's not one recipe, but I think doing it together is certainly key. And you've led the way for so many through your example. So we thank you for that. I'm going to I've got a couple of questions in the chat, and this will be for any of our panelists here. We've got a question from Jesse. With California Equal Pay Act, bona fide factors like an engineering degree are used to continue unequal pay. Are advocates looking to remove these bona fide factors in the law to make the fight more equal? Who would like to take that?
Try to answer that. I think so. As I mentioned, in California, we've strengthened our state Equal Pay Act in a number of ways. One of those ways was to ensure that any justification that an employer can give for a gender or now race, ethnicity-based pay disparity has to actually be an authentic, bona fide, real, non-sex or non-race-based justification that explains the gap. So it is the case that if an employee, a worker, let's say a woman who is an engineer, brought an equal pay claim because she found out her male colleague doing the same or substantially similar work was being paid more, it is true that if the employer can point to a bona fide or legitimate non-sex-based reason for that pay gap, that may be a defense if it's a legitimate, if it's a real reason. But the way in which the California law was strengthened is that the proposed defense by the employer, this bona fide factor that allegedly explains the pay differential, the non-sex-based factor, has to be, and this is where it's stronger than federal law, related to business necessity. So it can't just be some random factor that has nothing to do with the business, with the job at hand. And it also has to account for the full pay differential. So let's say an engineer was a woman engineer, found out she was being paid let's say, $20,000 less a year than her male counterpart. She goes to her employer and the employer says, well, he had an additional year of experience before. That 1 year probably wouldn't account for a $20,000 differential. So that's an important also limiting factor. And then finally in California, the employer has to show that there was no other way to accomplish that business necessity. So it's a pretty strong limitation on the defenses that an employer can use. And so I kind of give that context for anyone who's not as familiar with the types of defenses an employer can provide. And so here, if, of course, a lawyerly answer, it really depends on the situation. But if the workers were, let's say engineers, and that engineering degree was actually relevant to the job, then it really could be a legitimate defense under the law. However, if these are two, grocery store workers, a woman finds out she's being paid substantially less than her male counterpart, and the employer says, well, he has an engineering degree, that is not related to the business. There is no relation to the job at hand. So that would not be a lawful justification. So I don't know if, Jesse, that gets at the exact question, and I'm going to put my email in the chat. I'm happy to talk more specifically, but it would have to be related to the job, not just a kind of random excuse that the employer came up with.
Thank you, Jessica. And before you mute your mic, one more question related to ERA. How do you get funding to do work like this?
Like all nonprofits, we get it where we can, but a variety of sometimes foundations, but we rely heavily on individual donors as well. And I know, of course, organizations like AUW and maybe the Workers Center.
Definitely the Law Center.
Right.
Definitely.
But I appreciate that question.
Funding from the university.
I appreciate that question because we all, Ruth has an amazing workers' rights clinic. AUW does many amazing things. Research, which you all should check out their equal pay reports, but also supporting cases like Aileen. So anyone who's interested in supporting any of these our organizations, there are ways to do that on our website. So appreciate the question, and thanks, Julie.
Yeah, no problem. We've got a minute or two to just close out before we share some resources. And I'm wondering if any of the panelists have some final thoughts that they'd like to share related to your organization or the film. We can just popcorn it if any of our panelists have some final thoughts to share.
Well, AAUW is a local organization. It has a local branch that people can join. And we also work for education. We give scholarships, and the national organization finances women's graduate scholarships, graduate studies to the tune of $6 million a year. So if you know someone who wants to pursue an education degree to get more qualified, please make sure you check out aauw.org.
Great commercial, Peg. I was opening the door. Anybody else want to give a last minute plug? Kelly.
Say, of course, my dogs are going to ruin it, but I'll just say that the Women's Bureau is here for you. If you don't know how to start a journey and you just need someone to talk to, we can help you navigate that journey. Just reach out to us.
If I can just tag on as another federal agency, EEOC is just a tool in your toolbox. And I also just want to put out a shout out to Aileen and Jessica, because clearly it takes a lot of bravery and persistence and vision to stick with this. And so we just serve that. It's really on the folks out there. And I hope you're taking a lot of heart from what you're hearing today.
Beautiful.
I'll just say I think Linda put this in the chat, but if you want to hear about how you can support ongoing advocacy to strengthen equal pay laws, you can join the ERA action team, where you'll get email notifications about pending legislation or other advocacy that if you want to, you can engage in. I'll put the link again in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. And I certainly want to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists here, the organizations represented who make up BASIC, the Bay Area Equal Pay Collaborative. Equal pay, it's basic, very basic and very important. And we hope you all learned something today, because it is through this increased awareness and understanding and collective action among women of all ages and our allies that we encourage institutions, teams, corporations, the government to influence societal change for the future generations of women in all the world of sports and beyond. So I want to quickly ask my colleague Quetzal to share her screen with some resources that we put together for you all. You are going to receive a follow-up email with this resource guide for you all to have at your disposal, because we really want to make it a point that you engage with us if you've got questions, or if you just like to study up and learn more for your knowledge. You heard that piece of advice from Aileen to keep learning. So here are some resources where you can keep learning and where you can find the help that you might need if you feel you are a victim of pay discrimination. So you can look for this in your email box tomorrow, and it'll be coming from Eventbrite as an attachment. That'll be my goal, to get that out to you all. So you can stop sharing now, Quetzal. Put our speakers all back on screen as we wave goodbye to our participants here on screen. Thank you all very, very much.
And thank you, Julie, for putting this all together and for leading us together in this journey.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And Quetzal and Cecilia too, who are with me. We are all here to serve you. Thank you.
Thank you
Take
to
care.
the Office of Women's Policy for all the great work they do, and for being an inspiration to all of us under Julie's leadership and with Quetzal and Cecilia.
Thank you, Ruth. Appreciate that. Take care, folks. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.